I was 24 years old when it happened. I had just moved into a small apartment in a quiet, sleepy town in rural Alabama. At first, the place seemed perfect, cozy, affordable, and just far enough from the city to feel like a retreat. I had been living alone for a few months, adjusting to the solitude, when strange things started happening. It began with little noises, faint creaks and groans that I couldn't explain. I thought it was just the house settling. After all, the building was old, with thick wooden floors and creaky walls. But then things started escalating. One night, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking toward my bedroom. I froze, my heart racing. The house was empty. I had just come home from work and I was alone. I held my breath, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. The steps grew louder, closer, until they reached the doorway of the living room. I stood up, my knees shaking. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But there was no response, just the sound of my own voice echoing off the walls. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and crept down the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached my bedroom door. I opened it slowly, half expecting to find someone standing there, but the room was empty. Nothing seemed out of place. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. The days that followed were filled with more odd occurrences. I'd hear whispers when there was no one else in the room, and I'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye. The temperature would suddenly drop in certain parts of the apartment, and I'd feel an unsettling presence, like someone was watching me. One evening, I was sitting in the living room reading a book. The only light came from the dim lamp beside me. Suddenly, the lamp flickered and then went out. I stood up to check the bulb, but before I could, the room was plunged into total darkness. The air grew heavy, and I could hear the sound of breathing, low and ragged, coming from somewhere in the room. I turned on my phone's flashlight, my hands trembling. That's when I saw it, a shadow standing at the far corner of the room. It was tall, thin, and didn't have any distinct features. It was just a mass of darkness, watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away slowly, still shining the light in its direction. The shadow didn't move, just stood there, frozen. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air. I didn't know what to make of it. I told myself I was just tired, that it was probably a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It was the next night that everything changed. I had gone to bed early, hoping to get a full night's rest for once. The apartment was completely silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind outside. But then, in the dead of night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the walls. It was a slow, grating noise like fingernails on a chalkboard, only louder. It echoed through the apartment, sending chills down my spine. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The noise was coming from the hallway. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but it sounded like something was moving, dragging itself along the floor. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed for security and cautiously got out of bed. I tiptoed down the hallway, the scraping growing louder with each step. The apartment was completely dark, and I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. I shone my flashlight ahead of me, my hands shaking. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, at the foot of my bedroom door, was a figure. It was hunched over, dragging itself on all fours. Its face was pale, its eyes wide and black, staring directly at me. It was dragging itself toward me with unnatural speed, its limbs contorting in ways they shouldn't have been able to. Its mouth opened in a wide grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move, locked in place by fear. The thing stopped right in front of me, its face inches from mine. I could smell the stench of decay, like something dead had been lying there for weeks. Its mouth opened wider, and in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the depths of the earth, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, swinging the bat in desperation. The moment I made contact, the creature let out a horrible screech, its body contorting violently. It disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of rotting flesh. I ran out of the apartment that night, not bothering to grab anything. I didn't care about the rent or the lease anymore. I never went back. Even now, I don't know what that thing was or why it was haunting me. All I know is that I wasn't the first to live there. After I left, I did some digging and found that the building had a history, one of death and darkness. The previous tenant had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors about a family that had once lived there and suffered a terrible fate. And now, I'm just trying to forget. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I still hear that scraping noise. It's faint, but it's there, as if it's waiting for me to come back.
Next story.
It started on a night much like any other. I was driving back home from work, the kind of late hour where the streets are empty and the air feels thick with a coldness that makes your skin crawl. I had taken the back roads, hoping to avoid the traffic on the main highway. The headlights of my car cast long shadows on the trees as I sped past them, the only noise being the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. That's when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became. There was something in the woods, just off the side of the road. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing completely still. I didn't know if it was a person or some trick of the light, but it felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing games with me, but I couldn't help glancing back every few seconds. The figure didn't move, it was just standing there, watching. I slowed down as I passed, my heart starting to pound in my chest. That's when it happened. The thing stepped forward, its form emerging from the darkness like a shadow coming to life. I could barely make out its features. There was something terribly wrong about the shape of it, something unnatural. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch impossibly far. I swear its eyes were glowing, though it was too dark to see clearly. The worst part? It wasn't human. In a panic, I slammed on the gas, speeding away from the figure as fast as I could. My mind was racing with thoughts of what it could be. A bear? A person in a costume? But deep down, I knew it was something far worse. As I drove, the road stretched on and the woods grew thicker. The trees closed in around me and the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked in my rearview mirror. There it was again. The figure was behind me now, walking at an impossible pace, its legs moving too fast, too fluidly. My heart skipped a beat and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the thing kept coming closer. It wasn't running, yet it was gaining on me with every passing second. My eyes flicked to the speedometer. I was going 70 miles an hour. Suddenly, I felt the car lurch, like something had brushed against it. I glanced to my side and saw the thing, right next to my window. It was so close, I could see its features more clearly now. Its face was a twisted, contorted mask of malice, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of yellow. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins that pulsed under the surface like they were alive. I screamed and swerved, narrowly avoiding the guardrail as I fought to keep control of the car. The road ahead turned into a sharp curve and I saw it. A small bridge. I floored the gas pedal, desperate to escape. But as I reached the bridge, the car suddenly stopped, as if an invisible force had yanked on the brakes. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned the wheel, trying to keep the car from going over the edge. But it didn't matter. The car didn't move. I looked out the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and saw the figure standing just outside my door. It was impossibly close now, and I could hear its breath, ragged and wet, as it leaned closer to the window. Its face was pressed against the glass, its eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. Then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." And that was when I knew. It wasn't just some creature. It was something else, something older, something that had been there long before I even existed. It had been watching me, it had been waiting. My mind scrambled for an explanation. I had read stories, ghost stories, local legends, things about haunted roads and restless spirits, but none of them seemed real. Not until now. Suddenly, the car jerked forward as if the brakes had released on their own. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me as I sped away, my heart racing. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, and I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. I finally reached the end of the road, where the lights of civilization flickered into view. My car was shaking, and my hands were trembling as I pulled into my driveway. I didn't even bother to turn off the engine. I just sat there for a long time, staring out at the night, trying to calm my breathing. But I knew one thing for sure. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some random encounter. It had followed me, and it wasn't done with me yet. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't leave the house much. Every time I walked outside, I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing was still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to slip up. Then one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a tap on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, louder this time, more deliberate. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. I crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. There it was, the same figure, standing just outside my window, its face twisted in that same horrifying grin. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to escape. That's when the whispers started. At first, it was just a soft sound, like the wind rustling through the trees. But then it grew louder, more insistent, like it was right next to me. "You can't hide from me," the voice said, low and guttural. "I'll find you, always." I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the door, but before I could reach it, I felt something grab me from behind. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, like the touch of death itself. I turned around, but there was nothing there, except for the faint outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room. The thing was in my house now. I ran, not caring where, just desperate to get away. I bolted out the door and into the night, not stopping until I reached the local diner, hoping to find anyone who could help. But when I walked in, everything was different. The diner was empty, save for one person, the waitress. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. I nodded, too terrified to speak. She sighed as if she had been waiting for me to come. "You're not the first," she said quietly, "and you won't be the last." She handed me a napkin, and I looked down at it, my heart stopping when I saw what was written. "Stay away from the road, don't look back." I knew what she meant now. I had crossed a line I couldn't erase. And that thing? It wasn't just a ghost, it wasn't a spirit, it was a curse. A curse that had been passed down through generations, waiting for someone foolish enough to stumble across it, and now it had me. Every night since, it's been getting closer. I hear the tapping on the window, the whispers in the dark. I don't know how much longer I can run. I don't know how much longer I can hide. But I do know one thing. It's not over.
Next story.
It was my first week in a new job, working as a night security guard for an old, run-down office building in the heart of the city. The place had been vacant for years, and my supervisor, Mr. Ellis, warned me that it was a quiet job and that I shouldn't expect any disturbances. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the quiet. The thought of just walking the halls for a few hours each night sounded peaceful. The building itself was a relic from a different era. It had once been a thriving business hub, but time hadn't been kind. The walls were cracked, the elevators barely functional, and there was a constant hum of malfunctioning lights overhead. Despite the deteriorating state of the building, it still had a certain charm, as if it had seen decades of stories and lives come and go. My shift started at midnight, and the first few nights were uneventful. I would walk the hallways, check the floors, and make sure everything was secure. The old, dusty offices were locked, and the eerie silence of the building was all I had for company. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant sound of a door creaking or a floorboard groaning, but nothing too alarming. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to take a darker turn. I was on the second floor, walking past a row of unused offices when I heard it. A soft voice, faint at first, but clear enough to make me stop in my tracks. It was a woman's voice, murmuring something I couldn't quite make out. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. I shook it off, thinking it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks. But as I continued my rounds, the voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." I froze. It wasn't possible. The building was supposed to be empty. I checked every office, but no one was there. I was alone, or so I thought. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me after hours of silence. Still, there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't go away. I went down to the basement next. The air down there was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I made my way through the dark concrete hallway. The basement was mostly storage, with old furniture and boxes stacked high. As I turned the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a woman dressed in an old-fashioned office dress, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She stood there, motionless, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I took a step forward, unsure if she was real or just a figment of my tired mind. She didn't move. Her eyes, dark and hollow, never left mine. "Hello?" I called out, but she didn't respond. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I cautiously approached her. The air grew colder with each step. When I was only a few feet away, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating, hovering just above the concrete floor. My heart raced, and I turned to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor. The woman's face slowly turned toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, maybe recognition or even sadness, before she opened her mouth. The words that came out were not the ones I expected. "Help me. It's too late for me." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was a chilling undertone. Before I could respond, she vanished, like she had never been there at all. The room was silent again, but the heavy feeling remained. I stood there, trembling, my breath shallow. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it was something I couldn't ignore. I tried to tell myself it was just a hallucination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The voice, the woman, whatever it was real. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, every time I opened a door, I expected to see her again. The quiet creaks and groans of the building now felt more like whispers, like the building itself was alive with secrets. And then the voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." I ran up the stairs to the second floor, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. I needed to leave before whatever was haunting this place decided to make itself known again. But as I passed by the old offices, I noticed something strange. One of the doors was ajar. It wasn't like that before. I knew I had checked all the rooms, locked and secured them, just like Mr. Ellis had told me to. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open. Inside, the office was dark, the blinds drawn, but there was a faint light coming from the corner. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me. The air was colder here, and the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I saw it then. A desk, covered in dust, with an old-fashioned typewriter sitting on top. The machine was running. Someone was typing on it, but there was no one there. The keys clicked and clacked as if a ghostly hand was working it, typing words I couldn't read. Suddenly, the typewriter stopped. The room fell silent. Then, in the darkness, I heard her voice again. The woman. This time, her voice was clearer than ever. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to die. I turned around, my heart racing, and there she was again. The woman standing in the doorway, her eyes hollow and empty, her face pale and gaunt. She reached out to me, her hand trembling, her expression twisted in pain. "Help me," she whispered, her voice full of sorrow and desperation. I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate. The fear that gripped me was overwhelming, and I could feel my strength slipping away. "I can't help you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how." The woman's face changed. Her eyes grew wide with something dark, something that felt like anger. She took a step forward, and I could see it now. The marks on her neck, the bruises, the signs of struggle. She had been trapped here, just like me. "You can help me," she said in a low, menacing tone, her voice now more of a growl than a plea. "You have to help me." In a panic, I backed away, running toward the door. As I grabbed the handle, I heard her scream, a sound that echoed through the building like 1,000 souls in torment. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold air filling my lungs. I was shaking, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why had she been trapped here? And why had she come to me? I never went back to that building again. I handed in my badge the next day, never telling anyone about the woman in the basement. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear her voice. And I wonder, if I hadn't run, what might have happened. Maybe she would have found peace. Or maybe she would have taken me with her.
Next story.
I had just moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and it seemed like the perfect place to escape from the stresses of city life. The house was nestled at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by tall, overgrown trees and thick underbrush. The kind of place people passed by and didn't give a second thought to. The previous owner had passed away a few months before, and his relatives didn't want anything to do with the house. It was old, creaky, and clearly in need of some TLC, but it had charm. I was ready to start fresh, so I signed the lease and moved in. The first few days were peaceful enough. The house was spacious, with large rooms and hardwood floors that creaked underfoot. There was a stone fireplace in the living room, and a big empty kitchen that I could imagine hosting dinner parties in. But as the days went by, I started noticing odd things. The house, despite its quiet exterior, felt unsettling. The air was thick, almost oppressive. It was as if the walls were holding something in, something dark, something heavy. At night, I could hear faint noises, whispers that I couldn't quite place. The floors would creak as if someone was walking around when I was sure I was alone. Sometimes I'd find objects moved around. My keys would be in a different spot, or a book I had left on the table would be on the floor. I told myself I was just imagining things. The house was old, after all. Old houses make noises. But it wasn't just the noises that bothered me. It was the feeling. That feeling that something wasn't quite right. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I felt it again. The air growing heavier, the pressure building in my chest. I was sitting by the fireplace, reading a book when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I hadn't heard anyone enter the house. I was alone. I stood up and cautiously moved toward the stairs. The footsteps stopped the moment I started climbing. There was nothing, no one. I checked every room, turning on the lights, but I found no sign of anyone. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I had no proof. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things, whispering voices just beyond my hearing. The sensation of being watched. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to move. But when I looked, nothing was there. The next morning, I decided to go into town and see if I could learn more about the house's history. I went to the local library, hoping to find something in the archives. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Hargrove, was happy to help. "Oh, that house," she said when I mentioned where I was staying. "It's been there a long time. Back in the late 1800s, it was owned by a family called the Fairfields. They were well known in town, but there were rumors about them. Some said they were involved in strange practices, maybe even witchcraft. The house has always had an eerie reputation." "Strange practices?" I asked, trying not to sound too skeptical. She lowered her voice, glancing around before leaning in closer. "They say the family did things to keep themselves in power, things that weren't natural. Some of the townsfolk believed they made deals with the devil, and when the last of the Fairfields died, the house was abandoned for years. But every once in a while, someone moves in, and then they leave, usually in a hurry, with nothing but fear in their eyes." I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't help but wonder if what Mrs. Hargrove said had anything to do with the strange occurrences I'd been experiencing. Later that night, I returned home, determined to keep my mind busy. I cooked dinner, ate in silence, and then decided to go for a walk around the property. The house sat on several acres of land, and there was an old barn at the edge of the property that I had yet to explore. The sun was setting, casting long, creeping shadows across the yard as I walked toward the barn. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The barn door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had checked it the day before, and it had been locked tight. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should go inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty, the smell of old hay and rotting wood overwhelming. The barn was empty, save for some old crates and broken furniture. But as I moved deeper into the barn, I felt something shift. A strange presence, as if the space itself was alive, watching me. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard a loud thud behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, barely audible, coming from the shadows in the far corner of the barn. "Leave, before it's too late." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was unmistakably human, but it didn't sound right. It was distant, as if it was coming from far away, yet right next to me at the same time. I didn't think, I just turned and ran. I bolted out of the barn, my feet barely touching the ground, and didn't stop until I was back inside the house, locking the door behind me. The next few days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. The whispers continued, growing louder and more distinct. I could hear them in every room, in the walls, in the floorboards. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming. And the shadows, they seemed to move of their own accord. It was stretching and shifting when I wasn't looking. I didn't feel safe in my own home. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it any longer. I decided to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and walked toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. I turned, and there, at the top of the stairs, was a figure. A woman, pale and dressed in a long, tattered white gown. Her face was obscured by her long hair, and her hands hung limply by her sides. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The woman took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath her. She didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. I felt as though I couldn't breathe, as though she was pulling the air out of the room. "Leave," she whispered, her voice low and hollow, like it came from a grave. "Leave, or you'll be next." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, out the door and into the night. I never went back to that farmhouse. I found a small apartment in the city, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. The memory of the woman in the gown, the whispers in the walls, still haunts me. And sometimes when the wind howls late at night, I swear I can hear her voice calling to me from the darkness. "Leave, before it's too late."
Next story.
I had always been the logical type. The kind of person who scoffed at stories of ghosts, spirits, and the supernatural. I was raised in a household where everything had a logical explanation, and my parents instilled in me the importance of reason over superstition. So when I moved into the small, inexpensive apartment in the quiet part of town, I didn't think twice about the rumors I'd heard from the neighbors. "It's an old building," the landlord had warned me, "but it's safe. Just ignore any strange sounds. Old houses make noises." I nodded, dismissing his words as something he probably told every tenant. The apartment was cheap, close to my new job, and perfect for someone just starting out like me. It had character. Creaky floors, uneven walls, and a small window that looked out over a narrow alley. Nothing that would deter me. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd spend my days working long hours and my nights unpacking boxes, getting used to my new routine. But then it started. The whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe the pipes. But when I was lying in bed one night, reading a book, I heard it again. The soft, barely audible sound of someone talking. I put the book down and strained my ears, but the voice was too faint to understand. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, but deep down, I knew something was off. The whispers came every night, always at the same time, around 2 a.m. They were quiet, like a conversation happening just out of earshot, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. I never recognized the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't soothing. It was like someone was watching, just waiting for me to hear them. I decided to ignore it at first, hoping it would go away, but the whispers grew louder, more persistent. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel that strange weight in the room, like someone was standing just behind me, watching me sleep. I'd spin around, only to find nothing there. One night, I could take it no longer. The whispers were louder than ever, and they seemed to be coming from the corner of my room. I grabbed my phone and shone the flashlight into the dark corner, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. Just darkness. I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the next day, something happened that made me question everything. I'd been having a pretty normal morning when I came home from work to find the apartment door wide open. I was sure I had locked it when I left. Double-checked it even. But it was open. I hesitated before stepping inside, heart pounding in my chest. My eyes scanned the room, expecting the worst. Someone had broken in, maybe? But nothing seemed amiss. My books were still on the shelf, my kitchen spotless, except for one thing. On the kitchen counter was a note written in an elegant, flowing script. I didn't recognize the handwriting. The note simply read, "You're not alone." I felt the blood drain from my face. Who could have written this? No one had access to my apartment except me. And yet, here it was, clear as day. My hands trembled as I stared at the note, then I heard it. A soft creak behind me, coming from the living room. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I immediately bolted to the front door, locking it behind me. I didn't know who or what was in that apartment, but it was something I couldn't deal with alone. The next day, I called the landlord, asking if anything unusual had happened in the building. He seemed surprised by my question, but after a long pause, he said something I will never forget. "Well, there's one thing. There was an old tenant who used to live in your apartment. She disappeared a few years ago. No one knows what happened to her. Her name was Evelyn." I asked him for more details, but he wouldn't say much beyond that. He seemed nervous, like he wanted to change the subject. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn was somehow connected to what was happening in my apartment. The whispers grew more frequent after that, almost like they were following me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was hearing things out of stress or exhaustion, but there were too many coincidences. The whispers started calling my name, soft, almost pleading. One night, desperate for answers, I went to the local library to search for anything related to Evelyn. After hours of sifting through old news clippings and property records, I finally found something. There was a report from a few years back about the sudden disappearance of a woman named Evelyn Stone, who had lived in the apartment I now called home. The article mentioned that her neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, but when the police investigated, they found no signs of foul play. Evelyn had simply vanished. There were no traces of her left behind. The more I read, the more I became convinced that something had happened to her in that apartment, something that had left a lingering presence, a residue that I couldn't escape. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to confront whatever was in my apartment. I wasn't going to let it control me any longer. That night, I set up a camera in my living room to record the activity. I turned off all the lights and sat in silence, waiting. The clock ticked on, and the air grew thick with tension. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., I heard the whispers again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I stood up, walked toward the corner of the room where the voices seemed to be coming from, and spoke. "Who are you? What do you want?" The room fell silent. And then a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there, whispered back. "Help me." I froze. The voice sounded like a woman's. It was faint, fragile, like it had been trapped for years. My heart raced as I repeated the question, but the whispers only grew louder, surrounding me, as if the air itself was alive with voices. The camera, which had been sitting still on the table, suddenly flickered to life. The screen showed nothing but static at first. But then a figure appeared. A faint outline of a woman, standing in the corner of the room where the whispers had originated. I could barely make out her features, but her face, it was twisted, contorted in an expression of fear and sadness. In that moment, I understood. Evelyn hadn't left. She was still there, trapped, lost, reaching out for help, but no one had been able to hear her. No one had even known she was there, suffering until now. I didn't know what to do. The ghost, if that's what she was, didn't seem malevolent. She seemed lost, confused, as if she didn't even know she had passed. The whispers, the strange occurrences, they were her cries for help. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know how to help her move on, but I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed my things, left the key on the counter, and walked out without looking back. I don't know if Evelyn ever found peace. I don't know what happened to her after I left, but I never went back to that apartment, and I never will.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghosts. I thought the stories were nothing more than old wives' tales, meant to entertain on stormy nights or around campfires. That was until I moved into my new apartment in the city. The place was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, tucked away in an older building on the edge of town. It was affordable, which was why I chose it. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was quiet, and it had that rustic charm I'd always liked. The landlord had given me a warm smile and a firm handshake, telling me the apartment had been recently renovated, but he had warned me about one thing. "It's an old building," he said, "so things might creak, but nothing to worry about. It's safe." At the time, I thought little of it, writing it off as the usual disclaimer landlords use to cover their backs. After all, every building has its quirks, right? The first few nights were peaceful. I got unpacked, settled in, and even invited a few friends over to help me make the space my own. There was a cozy energy to the apartment, despite its age, and I began to feel comfortable. But then came the sound. It was subtle at first, so quiet I thought I was imagining it. I would be in bed, reading or watching something on my phone, and I would hear a soft tapping. It would start at the edge of the room, near the door, and then move in rhythmic intervals. At first, I assumed it was just the pipes, or maybe the building settling. After all, it was old. But the sound, it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like something or someone was tapping on the walls with a gentle, deliberate rhythm. The first few times, I told myself it was nothing, but after it happened again the next night, I began to get uneasy. It was always at the same time, around midnight, when everything was silent and still. It wasn't just the tapping, though. As the days went on, other things started happening. Items would be moved around. A book I left on the counter one night would be on the floor the next morning. My bathroom light would flicker on and off, even when I hadn't touched the switch. I convinced myself it was the apartment's old wiring, or maybe I was just forgetful. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, I decided to stay up late to get some work done. The tapping started again, just as it had before. This time, I was determined to find out what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hall. The air in the apartment had changed. It felt heavier, colder. As I walked toward the source of the sound, I noticed that the temperature in the hallway had dropped drastically. My breath came out in a visible puff, and I shivered. The tapping continued, but now it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from the closet in the far corner of the hallway, the one I had ignored since I moved in. I don't know why, but something in my gut told me I needed to open that door. I slowly reached for the doorknob, and the moment my fingers touched it, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my hand still on the knob. And then, almost against my will, I twisted it and pulled the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The closet was empty, save for an old, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. It was large, larger than any mirror I had seen before, and it was framed in tarnished silver with intricate swirling patterns etched into its surface. But it wasn't just the mirror that frightened me. It was the reflection. In the mirror, I didn't see myself. Instead, I saw a dark figure standing just behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer this time. It was a tall, dark shape with no distinguishable features, just a silhouette that seemed to fade and shift with the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, but I couldn't look away from the mirror. I felt drawn to it, as though something inside me was telling me to keep looking. The figure in the reflection began to move. Its hand reached out slowly at first, then faster. My breath caught in my throat as the hand came closer to the surface of the mirror, almost as if it were reaching for me. "Leave," a voice whispered, faint but clear. It was a voice that didn't sound human. It was low, guttural, and ancient. The words felt like they were inside my head, pressing against my skull. Without thinking, I slammed the closet door shut. The tapping returned immediately, louder and more frantic. I backed away from the door, my chest tightening, and I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was louder, more urgent. "Leave. Now." I didn't know what to do. The voice in my head was overwhelming. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, calling the landlord, desperate to find someone who could explain what was happening. He picked up on the second ring. "Hello?" "Mr. Harris, something's happening in this apartment. There's something wrong here. I don't know how to explain it. I need you to come over, please." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, but it's too late for that," he said, his voice strangely calm. "The apartment isn't just old, it's cursed. The mirror in that closet is not meant to be disturbed. I tried to warn you." I didn't know what to say. I was too terrified to even speak. "The thing you're seeing," he continued, "is not a person. It's the spirit of the previous tenant, a man who died in that very room. He was obsessed with the mirror. The tapping, the moving objects, those are all signs of his presence. It's trying to claim you, just like it claimed him." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I managed to choke out. "Because no one believes it. No one listens until it's too late." There was a pause, and then he added softly, "You need to leave. Now." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I felt my body start to tremble as the voice inside my head continued to call out to me, urging me to come closer to the mirror. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and fled from the apartment. As I reached the door, I heard the softest whisper, but this time it wasn't in my head. It was right behind me, chilling and cold. Too late. I never went back. I couldn't. And to this day, I don't know what was in that mirror, but I know this. Whatever it wasn't done with me.
Next story.
I had just moved to a new town, looking for a fresh start. A change of pace, you know? I had grown up in the city, surrounded by constant noise, always busy, always moving. But here, in the small town of Wilkesboro, things were different. Peaceful, quiet. It was supposed to be a place where I could settle in and breathe a little. I found an apartment above a small old bookstore on the corner of Main Street. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Carmichael, was a bit eccentric but seemed kind enough. He showed me around the place before I signed the lease. It was a cozy one-bedroom with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and the kind of charm you only get from a building that's seen decades of life. Mr. Carmichael warned me, "This building has history. The upstairs apartment has had a few tenants over the years, and some of them didn't last long." I remember laughing nervously, thinking he was joking. It was probably just a quirky old man with a flair for storytelling. So I took the keys, moved in, and settled in for my new life. At first, everything was fine. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and explored the town. The bookstore below was quaint, with dusty shelves stacked high with old novels and obscure titles. Mr. Carmichael kept to himself, rarely bothering me unless I needed something. The silence in the apartment was calming, and I was starting to enjoy the peace. But after a few weeks, I began to notice things. Small things at first. Objects in the apartment would be out of place. A mug would be moved from the counter to the table. The door to the closet would be ajar when I was sure I had closed it. I chalked it up to being distracted, maybe just forgetful. But as the weeks passed, it got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Not the usual creaks of an old building settling. No, these were distinct, deliberate steps as if someone was walking down the hall outside my door. I was alone. I hadn't invited anyone over. The building was quiet at night, almost unnervingly so. I listened, holding my breath, waiting for the footsteps to stop. They didn't. They kept getting closer, louder, until they were right outside my door. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then, just as quickly, they stopped. I waited, expecting the door to open, but it didn't. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I had imagined it. But that night, the footsteps came again. This time, I decided to confront it. I waited, hidden in the shadows of my living room, trying to catch whoever was causing the noise. And that's when I saw it. A shadow moved under the door. It was slender, stretching across the floor like a dark, elongated figure. I froze, my heart pounding. The shadow didn't belong to anyone I knew. It wasn't human. It was darker than the dark, like it absorbed the light around it. It slithered across the floor just outside my door, moving with an unnatural grace. I grabbed my phone, trying to take a picture, but as soon as I raised it, the shadow vanished. The room felt colder, and a sudden pressure weighed down on my chest. I could barely breathe. I ran out of the apartment and down the stairs to the bookstore. Mr. Carmichael was sitting behind the counter, as always, reading a book. "Mr. Carmichael, do you..." My voice caught in my throat. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. He looked up at me, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "It's happening again, isn't it?" he asked, as if he had known all along. I nodded, too afraid to speak. He sighed, setting the book down. "You're not the first to experience it. This building has a history, you know. A dark one. The shadow you saw, it's tied to this place. It's been here longer than anyone can remember, and it feeds on fear. Feeds on fear? I repeated, confused. Yes, he said softly. It started many years ago, long before I took over the building. There was a family that lived in the apartment upstairs. They were good people, but they were plagued by this presence. It would torment them at night, show them things, feed on their terror. One by one, they all left, but the shadow remained. It's been here ever since. I was paralyzed with fear. What does it want? It doesn't want anything, Mr. Carmichael replied. It's not alive. It's a manifestation of all the fear and pain that has ever occurred in this building. It feeds on that energy, growing stronger each time someone new moves in. It will stop at nothing to make you leave. The weight of his words sank in, and I felt my stomach drop. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, knowing that something that dark and unnatural was lurking in the shadows. But when I turned to leave, Mr. Carmichael called out to me, "Wait, before you go, there's one thing you need to know." I hesitated, turning back to face him. "The shadow won't stop," he said grimly. "It doesn't let people leave. It never does. The only way to escape it is to confront it." I didn't know what he meant by that, but the fear that gripped me was overwhelming. I couldn't even look at the stairs leading to the apartment above. I just wanted to run, but something in me told me I couldn't. Not until I faced whatever it was that was haunting me. That night, I decided to try something. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I ventured back upstairs, my legs shaking with every step. The apartment was cold, eerily so. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it, the oppressive presence in the room. I could sense its eyes on me, even though nothing was visible. I stood in the middle of the room and spoke aloud, my voice trembling. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm not going to let you control me." For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. But then I heard it. The scraping sound of nails on wood, just like the first night. The shadow began to stretch across the room, darkening the walls, forming into a shape. The air grew thick with the smell of decay. I could feel the pressure building, the fear rising in my chest, but I refused to back down. I stood my ground, staring into the abyss of that shadow, willing it to go away. And then, in a moment of pure defiance, I stepped forward, towards it. The shadow seemed to recoil, dissipating into the walls like smoke. The room was quiet again, the oppressive feeling lifting. The next morning, I left Wilkesboro. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't live in a place that was tied to something so ancient, so terrifying. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I feel it, the shadow, watching me, waiting for me to return.
Next story.
I've been hesitant to talk about this, but I need to get it out. I don't know what happened, and I still don't understand it. But what I do know is that the place I used to live, something dark was there, something that shouldn't have been, something that was never human. I'll start from the beginning. I moved into an old house in a small town on the outskirts of nowhere. It was one of those houses that looked charming at first, but quickly started showing its age once you stepped inside. My neighbors were nice, but they were also the kind of people who didn't ask too many questions, which is exactly what I needed. I wasn't looking to make friends, just looking for a quiet place to escape the chaos of city life. The house was built in the 1920s, and it had all the hallmarks of an old home. Creaky floors, drafty rooms, and a lingering smell of must and dust. I didn't mind it at first. It had character. I liked that. There were a few things that stood out, though, things I couldn't explain at the time. The windows were sealed shut with some kind of old, brittle paint. The doors, especially the basement door, had a strange, unnatural weight to them, but nothing that really raised any alarms. I thought I was just being paranoid. That's what I told myself anyway. The first sign that something wasn't right came about 2 weeks after I moved in. It was a Friday night, and I had just finished a long week of work. I was exhausted and ready to hit the sack. I went to bed around midnight, but I couldn't fall asleep right away. It was a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that you only get in an old house, the kind of silence that's almost too thick, like it's pressing down on you. I tossed and turned, trying to ignore the feeling, but the longer I lay there, the worse it got. Then I heard it. A low, scratching sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, something stuck in the walls or attic. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder. more frantic. Then it stopped, but only for a few seconds. That's when the whispering started. It was faint, like someone trying to speak just below the level of hearing. At first, I couldn't make out the words. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or the wind playing tricks. But then the words became clearer, distinct, cold. I see you. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My heart raced and I held my breath, praying I had imagined it. But the whispering continued, low like a hiss. I see you. I see you. Each time the voice was closer, it felt like it was right beside my ear. I jumped out of bed, flipping on the light, my pulse pounding in my throat. The room was empty. There was no one there. I checked the closet, under the bed, and the bathroom, but everything was as it should be. I tried to dismiss it as just a bad dream, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could still hear the voice in my head. It wasn't right. It wasn't human. It felt like something ancient, like a presence that had been there long before I ever moved in. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, eyes wide, staring at the shadows in my room. The whispering never stopped. It would fade, only to return with greater intensity as if it was trying to lull me into some false sense of security before it struck again. By morning, I was a wreck. The next few days, I tried to go about my business like everything was normal, but it wasn't. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. At random times throughout the day, I would hear them. I see you. And the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. One afternoon, I decided to take a look in the attic. Maybe there was something up there, some kind of explanation. I went up, but all I found were dusty old boxes filled with things that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. A small handwritten note buried in the corner of the attic floor. It read, "They're always watching. The walls know." I froze. It made no sense. Who wrote this? Who had been here before me? That night, things got worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was alive. The walls, the floors, the very air, it all felt charged with some unseen force. Around midnight, I woke up to a pounding sound. It came from the basement, sharp and urgent. The sound was like someone banging against the walls, trying to break through. The whispers grew louder, and I could swear I heard my name, soft at first, but growing more desperate. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement. The door creaked and groaned, almost like it was trying to resist me, but I pushed through. The basement was cold, colder than it should have been, and smelled faintly of rot. I shone the light around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just old furniture, boxes, and more dust. But then I saw it. In the far corner, behind a stack of old crates, was a door. It wasn't like the other doors in the house. It was hidden, almost as if it was intentionally concealed. I walked over to it, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. When I touched it, the door rattled, like something was trying to break free from the other side. It was locked, but I knew deep down that this was the source of it all. The house, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was all coming from this door. Something was behind it, and it was waiting for me. That night, I had a nightmare. In it, the door in the basement opened. I saw something standing there. It was tall, too tall, with pale, gray skin that seemed to ripple like the surface of water. Its eyes were black, hollow voids that seemed to pull everything into them. It stepped forward, and I could feel the air grow thick with its presence. It spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it said, its voice like the scraping of metal against bone. I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, and I couldn't ignore what I had felt. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things and called a moving company. I couldn't take it anymore. But before I left, I went back to the basement one last time. I stood in front of that door, and this time, I could feel it. It was like the house itself was pushing me to open it, to release whatever was behind it. I couldn't do it. I wasn't strong enough. But as I turned to leave, I heard something. The whispering. It was different now. Louder, clearer, almost like it was right behind me. "It's not over," it hissed. "You can't escape." I ran. I didn't look back. I moved far away from that town, from that house, and never spoke about it again. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night when the world is silent, and every time I hear it, I see you.
Next story.
It was a quiet Friday night when the housewarming party started. I had just moved into a small old home on the edge of town. The kind of house that had that creaky charm, nothing fancy, but it felt right for me. My friends came over to help me settle in, and after a few hours of unpacking and laughing, we decided to start a small celebration. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a few drinks and good company. The house itself was a bit strange, though. The layout was odd. Rooms didn't quite align properly, and there were doors that led to nowhere. An odd design choice for sure. But I wasn't going to let that bother me. It was my first real home, and I was happy. The old wood floors creaked under our feet, and there was something comforting about the way the house seemed to settle when you walked through it. The temperature fluctuated, though. Sometimes it would feel cold out of nowhere, especially near the back hallway, near a room I had yet to explore. By midnight, the party was winding down. Most of the guests had gone home, and only a few of us were left. Close friends, lingering to chat. That's when I first heard it, a soft thudding noise. It was faint, like something gently tapping against the wall. At first, I thought it was one of the others moving around upstairs, but when I glanced around, everyone was sitting down, talking. The noise came again, a little louder now, but still faint. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, but no one seemed to have noticed. "Maybe it's just the house settling," one of my friends shrugged. But it wasn't just the house settling. I felt it in my bones. The sound didn't match the normal creaks and groans of an old house. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like knocking. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, brushing it off as some odd sound I hadn't noticed before. Still, something wasn't right. I stood up, excusing myself to check the sound. I walked toward the hallway, the air growing colder the closer I got to the back of the house. The thudding continued, louder now, like it was coming from behind the door at the end of the hall. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling slightly, unsure whether I should open it or leave well enough alone. But curiosity won out. When I opened the door, it was pitch dark inside. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The light was out. A part of me wanted to close the door, but another part of me, the one that had made me buy the house in the first place, pushed forward. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. It felt wrong. The air was thick, unnaturally so, and the silence was stifling. The thudding noise had stopped. But then, from the far corner, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It was vague at first, just a shadow. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly. A figure hunched over in the corner, its back turned toward me. It was unnaturally still, and its shape was too contorted, too unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in place. I didn't know whether to speak, to move, or to run. The figure shifted slowly, like it was sensing my presence. A low, raspy breath echoed in the room, and then it turned. The face that greeted me was not human. Its skin was pale and thin, stretched tight over its skull, and its eyes, black, empty voids, stared straight through me. Its mouth, wide and cracked, opened slightly, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the thing standing before me. Suddenly, it spoke. Its voice was a dry rasp, barely audible, but it carried through the silence like a thunderclap. "Get out!" I don't know how, but I turned and ran. I didn't care about the door. I didn't care about the darkness. I just had to get away from that thing. I bolted back to the hallway and slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged in my chest. My friends were waiting for me, looking at me with concern. "What happened?" one of them asked, but I couldn't find the words. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen. I didn't want to stay in the house anymore, but I couldn't leave. Everything I had worked for, everything I had dreamed of, was in those walls. I tried to push the memory of the creature from my mind, but it was impossible. Its face was burned into my thoughts. The chilling words echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing second. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep. The sound of that raspy breath kept me awake, filling the empty corners of the house. But when the sun rose, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I'd just been too tired, too overwhelmed with the new place, and my mind had played tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Days passed and life returned to normal, but the feeling of being watched never left. I started to avoid the back hallway, the room at the end of the hall, but there was no way to avoid it forever. One evening, a few days later, I found myself back at that door. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the need to confront whatever was there. I don't know what drove me, but I opened the door once again. The room was just as I remembered, cold and dark. But this time, the figure wasn't standing in the corner. It was standing in the middle of the room, its head tilted in that unnatural way, as if it were waiting for me. I tried to back out, but the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to face the creature, feeling its eyes upon me, the weight of its presence pressing down on me like a physical force. "Leave," it rasped again. I could barely hear it over the pounding of my heart in my ears. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but no words came out. Then, with terrifying clarity, it whispered one final thing. "You belong here now." The door opened on its own, and without thinking, I ran, this time not back to the safety of my friends, but straight out of the house. I never looked back. I left that house the next morning, leaving behind everything I had worked for, but everything I had built. I didn't know if I had been chased out, or if I had just finally accepted what the creature was telling me. I didn't stay long in town. I found another place to live, much farther away. But every now and then, I swear I hear that same voice echoing in the back of my mind, telling me to come back, to return. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that house, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget the eyes of that thing. And I'll never forget its voice saying, "You belong here now."
Next story.
I don't know why I even moved to that house. Maybe I thought it would be a fresh start, new city, new job, new life, but I should have known better. There was something wrong about that house. I can't explain it all, but I need to share this because it's been haunting me for months now, and the whispers still echo in my mind. I'd been looking for a place in a small town a few hours outside of the city. The house was a bargain, too good to pass up. 2 stories, an old, charming thing with a front porch that overlooked a small garden. It had character, the kind of place that people dream about owning someday, the kind that's somehow always a little too perfect to be real. But when I saw the for sale sign on the lawn, something drew me in. And before I knew it, I'd signed the papers. The owner, an elderly woman, had lived there for decades. She seemed nice enough, but her eyes, there was something off about her eyes, like she had seen too much. The first week in the house was peaceful, at least on the surface. I was alone, but that didn't bother me much. I liked my space, and the isolation wasn't unwelcome. I spent the days cleaning up and unpacking, but at night, things started to feel strange. It was subtle at first. Sounds in the walls, creaks in the floors that didn't match the house's age. Then there were the cold spots, concentrated in certain rooms. The air would drop by several degrees, and I'd feel an unnatural chill that wouldn't go away until I left the room. I tried to brush it off. Old houses do that, right? They settle, they shift. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had this nagging feeling, like I was being watched, but whenever I'd turn around, no one would be there. At night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing things from the corners of the house. The occasional knock, a soft thud, a faint scraping sound. I told myself it was just the wind, just the house, just my imagination. But one evening, things escalated. I'd been in the living room, reading, when the light above the fireplace flickered. It was odd, considering the bulb was new, and the electricity had been fine since I moved in. I glanced at the light, confused, and then, before I could even stand up to check it, the bulb exploded. Just popped. The entire living room plunged into darkness. I cursed under my breath and fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. As I stood up, I heard it, the soft padding of footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The house was still. Too still. I'm not sure what made me do it, but I walked to the stairs that led up to the second floor. The air grew heavier the closer I got, and then I heard it again, a distinct shuffle of feet, followed by a voice, low and rasping, almost a whisper. "Leave." I froze. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind. That voice, if you could even call it that, was real. "Leave," it repeated, more forcefully this time. And I knew right then that I was no longer alone in the house. I don't know how long I stood there, just frozen at the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to run, to grab my things and get out of there, but something held me in place. A sense of dread like nothing I've ever felt before. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the top of the stairs, so tall that its head brushed against the ceiling. I couldn't make out much of its shape, but its outline was clear enough. It was dark, its features shrouded in shadow. I couldn't even tell if it had a face, but I could feel it. Its eyes were on me, pinning me in place like it was studying me. The temperature in the room dropped another few degrees, and my breath fogged in front of me. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to move. Then the voice came again. Leave. This time I listened. I turned and bolted for the front door, heart pounding, but the door wouldn't open. It was like the house was holding me inside, like something was preventing me from escaping. I pulled harder, panicking, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door flew open, and I stumbled out onto the front steps. I didn't go back inside that night. I drove to a nearby hotel, terrified, shaken to the core, but I couldn't just leave. I couldn't let it win. I had to figure out what was going on. The next morning, I returned to the house with a sense of grim resolve. I walked through the front door, but it felt different now. The air was heavier, thicker, and the silence was suffocating. The house had changed. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, the shadows stretched longer than they should have, and as I made my way up the stairs again, I could feel something following me. It wasn't just a presence anymore, it was like I was being hunted. I went straight to the old woman's records, the papers she left behind. That's when I found it. Hidden between two old photographs of her and her family was a journal, faded and tattered. It was hers. The first few pages were harmless enough, just mundane details about her day-to-day life. But as I flipped through the pages, I started to see the pattern. She wasn't alone in that house. Not like I thought. She had written about strange occurrences, disembodied voices, cold spots, figures that would appear and disappear in the corner of her vision. It sounded like she had been tormented by the same thing that tormented me. But then the writing took a darker turn. She wrote about a presence, something that had been in the house long before she moved in, something that had come with the land. She described it as a being that had lived there for centuries, feeding on the fear of anyone who dared enter. And there was one final warning. Whatever you do, don't let it in. Don't let it out. I felt my stomach drop. She knew what was in that house, and it was too late for her. But it wasn't too late for me, I thought. If I could find a way to seal whatever it was in, maybe I could stop it. That's when I found the room. It was hidden behind a false wall in the basement, a small, narrow space that hadn't been there before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood, old and worn, as if they had been scratched there over centuries. And in the center of the room, there was a door, rusted shut, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same door I had seen in my nightmares. I didn't open it, but I knew I had to. I knew that if I didn't, the house would never let me leave. The whispers started again, soft at first, but growing louder as I stepped closer to the door. The air thickened, my breath catching in my chest. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice rasped, but it was too late. The door opened and everything went black.
Next story.
I've always been the skeptic. Rational, logical, level-headed. Nothing ever spooked me. I dismissed ghost stories as nothing more than people letting their imaginations run wild. That is, until the night I moved into the old Montgomery house. I didn't want to buy it, honestly. I was just looking for a place to crash while I settled into a new job in a new city. But when I walked into that house, I could feel something. I couldn't explain it, like an invisible weight in the air. I chalked it up to the house being old and abandoned for a while. I didn't think much of it at first. The Montgomery house had been on the market for ages. The realtor didn't even want to show me the house, which should have been a red flag, but I thought it was a trick to get me to more expensive. When I finally convinced her to let me in, she hurried through the tour, avoiding the upstairs like it was off limits. The house had this musty, stale smell to it, like it had been closed off for too long, and the furniture was still inside, though old and covered in white sheets. I should have turned around and walked out, but I didn't. It was a decent price, and the place had potential. I signed the papers that day. The realtor was too eager to get me out of there after the deal went through, and I didn't think much of it until later. That first night, I didn't notice anything too strange. I spent most of the evening cleaning and unpacking my boxes. The house felt cold, despite the heating running fine. The walls creaked and the old wooden floors groaned underfoot, but that was nothing unusual for a house of that age. I had no reason to be nervous. But after I went to bed that night, things changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. No particular reason, just an odd sensation pulling me from sleep. The house was eerily silent, too silent if you ask me. Not even the creaks of the old house settling, everything was still. And then I heard it, a faint tapping sound like someone lightly knocking on wood. I froze. My heart thumped in my chest. The sound came from upstairs, just beyond the hallway. At first I told myself it was the wind. The house was old, it probably had a draft. But when the sound repeated, closer this time, I knew it wasn't the wind. I climbed out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, the beams of light cutting through the darkness. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, and I winced at every step, hoping not to wake anything or anyone. At the top of the stairs, the door to the attic was ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. I didn't even know there was an attic. But there it was, a dusty, narrow staircase leading up to darkness. That tapping sound, it was coming from up there. I felt my pulse quicken, but I wasn't about to back down. I was a skeptic, right? Nothing was going to scare me off. I turned the knob and opened the door. The air inside was musty and thick, the kind of air you get in an attic that hasn't been opened in years. As I stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. The room was empty except for old, forgotten things. An antique rocking chair, a few boxes covered in cobwebs, and a dusty mirror hanging on the wall. But the worst part, the tapping stopped. Suddenly, everything was too still. That's when I noticed the mirror. I don't know why it caught my eye. Maybe because everything else in the attic was so dull and covered in dust, but this mirror, it was clean, like someone had been polishing it. I approached it slowly, instinctively knowing something wasn't right. The moment I got close enough, I saw it, a figure standing behind me. I whirled around, my heart racing. There was nothing there, no one in the attic. The air was suffocatingly still, and I felt dizzy. I turned back to the mirror. It wasn't just the reflection of the attic behind me. The figure wasn't just in the mirror. It was behind me, in the room. It was a woman, pale, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair disheveled and hanging in front of her face. Her eyes were hollow, dark sockets with no pupils, and she was staring at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, all I could do was stare back at her, frozen. Then she whispered something. "Get out." The words were faint, barely audible, but they echoed in my ears. I felt ice cold all over, a deep sense of dread crawling up my spine. I didn't know how I managed to do it, but I forced myself to turn and run out of the attic. I bolted down the stairs and out of the house into the cold night air. I stayed with a friend for the next few nights. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside, but after a while, curiosity gnawed at me, and I convinced myself it was all just my imagination. The house was old, right? Of course it would mess with your head. So 4 days later, I returned. This time, everything seemed normal. No tapping sounds, no strange mirror. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hair on your neck stand up. I decided to explore the attic again. This time, I went in with a sense of purpose. No more fear, no more hesitation. But when I opened the door, the air was thick with that same sense of dread. The rocking chair was gently swaying back and forth. The mirror was gone. I felt something behind me, and I turned around just in time to see her. The woman from the mirror. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Leave now," she whispered again, but this time I could feel her cold fingers brushing against my neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the figure in front of me. And then she smiled. A grin that stretched unnaturally wide across her face, her teeth jagged and broken, as though they didn't belong. "You should have listened." The last thing I remember was the coldness of her fingers on my neck, followed by darkness. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying on the grass, covered in dirt. I don't remember how I got there, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that house wasn't human. It wasn't a ghost. It was something else entirely. I didn't stay in that town after that. I packed up and left, never to return. I'm not a skeptic anymore, and I'll never forget the woman in the mirror.